Thank you, Jason. There's a lot. I have to reciprocate, and we've missed Jason since he's left the White House. It was a real pleasure to work with Jason, and on a not only a regular basis, but a daily basis on the collaborative effort between the White House and the State Department on these issues. And the only thing that mitigates missing Jason is he's created something completely from scratch at SEPA at Columbia, which is now one of the leading voices in international energy security, which is really a pleasure to see. And it's also reassuring for me, because it seems that any senior official from the U.S. administration that leaves finds a home in Jason's center. So there's a certain job security element to this for me as well. I appreciate that. Also, just to say the kind words from Oded, I hope that it's not 25 years that I work on this issue, but it surely is a challenging one. I'm sure we can find other things that are a little bit better to handle, that will have a more speedy, can come to a more speedy fruition. But let me start with what I was listening to the end of the comments by Charlotte Tzemach, my old friend, and we miss you here as well in Israel, but it's good to know that Israel still has you as a voice in this. The committee that you chaired was very important, but it shows the limitations of government work when you have committees that are established to set the guidance for policy. But if the policy doesn't actually follow the guidance of the committee by those who set up the committee, it shows a certain weakness to the system. But let me take a step back before I get to what Jason asked about what's happening here in the region, because I think what's important for this region, and there are more conferences on Mediterranean gas and Mediterranean energy than on Australian energy, and Australia has about 30 times the amount of energy coming out of the ground over the next 5 years. So it's quite remarkable. So let me, in that sense, in that context, take a step back of where we are. We're in the most transformative era in energy than we've seen in several generations. And that's because we've had a global shift in dynamics on both ends of the spectrum. So if you look at the classic energy spectrum, is supply and demand. That's what drives energy. The geopolitics contributes to price, it contributes to dislocation. But demand and supply, that's what runs energy. And we've had a major shift in supply and demand, in both supply and demand, and they're coincidentally happening at the same time. So on the demand side, we've seen that the OECD countries, led by the United States and the other OECD countries, they drove demand. And that's always been true and was never in doubt, except that it's no longer true. And now demand is being driven by the non-OECD countries, led by China and India. The next part of it is the supply side. So the supply on oil was obviously the OPEC countries that were leading suppliers, with Russia and a few other, a small handful of non-OPEC countries. And on gas, we had a similar, even though we're not a formal OPEC, we had a very small number of gas producers, largely because the infrastructure required for gas for many years was you had to build a pipeline, which was, in a sense, a Catholic marriage. You build a multi-billion-dollar pipeline, and you're committed to that route. But once you have the ability to export gas via LNG, that starts creating the dynamic in the market that it's a more liquid, not just technically liquid gas, but it's a liquid market, which actually creates a market. But even there, instead of the very small number of countries that were producing and exporting gas, we suddenly have brand new producers coming online all over the place. So first, along the coast of West and East Africa, we have new producers of both oil and gas. North Africa is going to get in on the action. Australia is going to have an enormous amount of gas coming out of the ground in the next few years, with investments of north of $90 billion already put in place, already invested. That's some expensive gas. Papua New Guinea is going to have an enormous amount of gas coming out. Mozambique alone's discovery is larger than the Eastern Mediterranean, with Tanzania as its neighbor coming online as well. Those are two countries that have no domestic market. So all that gas goes to export. And then, of course, you have the United States, where we were a declining producing country with all that comes from that, which means our geopolitics had to be affected by our declining production because our consumption was increasing, which meant that we could not rely on only the sources that we were importing from before. We had to look at West Africa. We had to look in the region. And we had a surprise. We all of a sudden, after we spent about billions of dollars of building import facilities for gas, we're now spending billions of dollars to build export facilities for gas because of the shale gas revolution. And the first year or two, everybody said, well, this is not real. it's not going to last. And then my first briefing on this, and I said, well, what about oil? Can we have shale oil? Oh, that's never going to happen. It's really expensive. And 2 years later, our imports of oil went from over 60% of our consumption to below 30%. It's a radical shift. We've increased our production by 2 million barrels a day. Now, 3 months ago, I would tell you, we're going to increase our production by 750,000 to 1 million barrels a day in 2015. Now, I don't know.
I'm tweeting that.
Please don't. But that's the power of, these are the volumes that we're talking about. So what does that mean? That means that countries such as the United States, and by saying countries, companies that are operating in countries such as the United States, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Mozambique, Russia, all have to spend, now having spent billions of dollars on this infrastructure, with prices falling, have to make sure that they're going to hold on to the market share that they expected to have. And they'll defend it. That leaves a second class of producing countries and companies. They have to figure out what is their competitive advantage to be able to play in this market. Because what's happened in the decline of the oil prices, which leads, of course, to a decline in the largely oil-linked gas prices, is that you had a number of factors that came into play all at the same time. More oil coming on the market, a slowdown in economic growth in China and India and elsewhere. So the demand side was being affected. On the national security front, where you had some impediments to price because of the national security premium, whether it was in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it was in Iraq, whether it was in Libya, a lot of those have stabilized. There was not, remember that the peak oil that we had this year was at $115 when ISIS took over Mosul. But once the international community got involved, the assumption in the markets was that the southern Iraq production was relatively secure. So prices started to decline. Libya under Gaddafi, and soon after Gaddafi, when exports started again, was at 1.5 million, went down to 250,000, and then went back up in this past late summer, back up to near 1 million. So you had a number, and then of course the P5+1 discussions with Iran seemed to give some kind of assurance to the region and to the global markets that, at least for now, there's some kind of stability. So that means that all of a sudden you had all these different factors that came in that drove the price down, and there are a few other factors. There's never only one price, only one cause, even though every headline seems to pick one and say this is the reason. So that brings us to this region. This is a region that had a very exciting discovery. Offshore Israel, offshore Cyprus, potentially offshore Lebanon. Who knows what happens offshore Greece? And this is a region that can really take advantage of this. It could bring about prosperity for the entire region. It can enhance security and stability, but only through collaboration and cooperation. The idea that this region will play a major role in driving gas prices or oil prices around the world, I think is a little bit extreme. And there were some that talked about Israel is now becoming a superpower in energy. Compared to what it was, yes, but only in comparative terms. So you have to look at it. What does it mean? How do you monetize it? So a number of factors. One, you have to make sure, how do you get that investment? How do you compete in that world of all the other producing companies wanting to defend their market share, especially in this era of oil prices? You have to have a regulatory environment that encourages companies to come and invest. You can't hide behind the idea of maybe there's a secondary boycott and that's why companies don't want to invest here. That's just not the case. Companies are not political beings as much as they are commercial beings. And if they think that their investment will be sound, that the rules of the game that they enter into will remain the same, that the legal structures will be there, and that the investment climate will be there, they'll come. And then there's the second part of it, that they know how they're going to profit. And that's about how do you commercialize the findings here. In other words, do they have the proof that this is going to be something that can be exported? And the reason that the United States got involved in this region and trying to promote that is in order to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity. Because there's a great opportunity here to deliver all of those things. All the countries in the region are going to have to get over a few political hurdles. Energy won't drive it, but it can be a big catalyst for it. But each country also has to make sure that they have that regulatory environment that encourages companies to come and invest. And the window to do that is closing. Because the last sentence that I'll say is, when oil prices go down this dramatically, the first thing that happens is new FIDs don't happen, new final investment decisions. Every company has to ultimately, after they do all these discussions with the potentials, they have to go to the board, and they have to defend it, and they have to reach FID. And if they can't reach FID, then there is no project. So yesterday, the news hit last night after the markets closed that Chevron decided to slow down or delay the decision about the Arctic investment in Canada. And they directly tied it to the current market conditions. So every company now has to look at what is the above-ground risk and whether this makes sense for me in this era of oil prices to make this kind of a multi-billion-dollar investment. And that's why it's so important to try to make those decisions here in Israel. And I think you heard that from other speakers. And I'll just say that I only heard parts of Minister Bennett's speech earlier today. But he said one thing, let the gas flow. And I'll combine that with what Shaul Tzemach just said. Make a decision. Get there. Let the gas flow. Come to agreements. They're all pending with Jordan, with Egypt, with Cyprus. It's all there for the taking. But if you keep having the argument over, but what is the tax revenue going to look like and who's going to own what, the best way to break a monopoly is to bring in more actors. Bring in more actors. And I think it's possible. Thank you.